Is Airbnb dead, or are you just not doing your research? Airbnb started out by people literally renting out air mattresses in their living room and people essentially paying to couch surf. It has now become somewhat of an institutional asset class with, big time investors turning entire buildings into Airbnb buildings. So it is definitely evolved as an asset class. And if you don't do your research and understand supply and demand metrics in your market, you can, jump into Airbnb investments that'll lose you tens of thousands of dollars. I have gone from being 24 years old and renting out my apartment on Airbnb to building hundreds of millions of dollars in Airbnb condos and investment properties. I've owned many Airbnb units over the years, and it's something that, I've watched as an asset class completely evolve and understand. I'm Meg Epstein. I am a CEO for the last decade. So I'm in a unique position of working with and speaking to a lot of institutional investors, meaning, big pension funds, big private equity funds that are interested in the Airbnb space as a segment. I've gotten to know several larger scale companies that want to rent out Airbnb units on a whole building basis, or, companies like Vacasa that went public, where they were managing tens of thousands of homes across the US that were on Airbnb. And so I've had some really great contests and watched how this has gone from people just renting out their couch or renting out an extra room to renting out their house to creating themed houses and themed units to entire buildings being dedicated to this group travel aspect. And what's really interesting is, it is very different from a traditional hotel model in that hotels are built and funded in such a way that is for, a 300 square foot on average room. Airbnb opens you up to a world of a million different types of living situations that you can rent out. And so it's something that I've watched in the last decade, especially post-COVID, really just become this wave of popularity, because not only does it give the owners of the real estate more flexible lifestyle, more income potential, but it's also, in some ways, if you have a family or you're traveling with a group or you want to stay somewhere longer term, you don't want to spend a bunch of money on, laundry and at a hotel and not having to eat out and not eating healthy or whatever, it offers something really special. So I think it's an incredibly powerful asset class that will continue to just become more and more institutional over time. And I think it's really easy for people to just say, oh, well, Airbnb's, gotten super oversupplied. And in a lot of cases, it's true. It has gotten oversupplied. But you really have to do your research if you want to be an Airbnb investor to understand the market you're going into. So one of the first things that I always look at is, what is the local sentiment about getting an Airbnb permit and issuing Airbnb? So when Airbnb first came out, there was no laws against it, obviously. But over the years, local jurisdictions have started really cracking down and passing laws in markets like, a St. Pete, for example. You can't even Airbnb anything for less than 30 days. Currently, that's what the rules are. And it's people, there's a negative connotation with Airbnb. So the very first thing you have to do is understand what your local rules are around Airbnb and understand the zones in which you can operate. If your Airbnb is in a neighborhood, there's always a risk that permit potential could get taken away by a local jurisdiction in the future. So if you're renting out your own home, fine, you're going to live there anyways, and this is just supplemental income. But if you're buying into a property just for the sake of Airbnb, and it is not any commercial zoning, which you can find on your city's website, you can even ask ChatGPT, this is where I live, help me understand the local municipal code. You really need to understand what is the local sentiment about Airbnb. If they're very, very against it, eventually it will become, out permitted. On the other hand, in terms of doing supply and demand research, easy way to do it is just by going on Airbnb and seeing, in a neighborhood you're considering investing in or a city you're considering investing in, looking at on Airbnb and seeing how many listings there are and really narrowing down on what we use pretty advanced software at my company to do this, but you can go on like AirDNA, for example, or just go on Airbnb and look at what are the average revenues for, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, what sort of investment type property you want, and really try to get a sense of how much you could rent this out for every night and seeing how many listings there are. In a place like Nashville, where I started, Airbnb investing went hugely popular. And it seems like everybody and their mom has turn their home into an Airbnb for group travel, because people love coming to Nashville to go, with groups and to go out and go to honky tonks. So you really have to, secondly, look at the market and see how many listings there are relative to whatever investment you're considering making. Really understanding the supply and demand metrics is key for getting into into an Airbnb investment. And then thirdly, I would say that one thing I learned was that, if you build within commercial zones or you build a building within a commercial zone, you will be prevented from ever not being able to be issued an Airbnb permit. That's really important for these investments because, like I said, you can end up not having your permit and your entire business model is gone if it's not a primary residence or something you could, you can always rent it out full time, of course, but it's not the same return metrics as renting it out on a short-term basis. So, those markets are actually better for what I do because that means that the amount of Airbnbs are limited and not every single person can just put their house on the market for short-term rental. So if you're traveling with a group or you're offering an Airbnb listing in the markets where it's super supply constrained, those are the markets that are going to be the highest income potential. You just have to do your due diligence and make sure that when you're buying the property that the Airbnb capability won't be taken away from you. Lastly, the markets that Airbnb still does the best have just generally a pro-business, lots of different factors that support hospitality, but they are the markets where people want to visit. So that's the Nashvilles, the Austins, Miami, New York, all major cities that have a strong hospitality component or group travel component are very prime for Airbnb. So Airbnb isn't dead. It just is a matter of doing your supply and demand research. If you want to learn more about flexible investment asset classes, watch this next video.